thank you for coming. And we are on this practically final session dedicated specifically about and the dedicated. So this session is dedicated to the new normal topic, which are surviving through at the moment, and hopefully this session will give us some ideas and theoretical and practical implications of this topic to the overall project on the EU and EU cooperation, competition, and other very complicated relations. So let me introduce participants. Hannes Meissner, University of Applied Sciences in Vienna. David Morris, Corvinus University from Budapest, and Archil Sikharulidze. I'm hesitating to introduce you because you're playing several roles. I know, being consultant, being a freelancer and consultant in Georgia, and also collaborator with MGIMO, which is in Moscow, and of course, very welcomed partner in our university, Southern Federal. And of course, me, Oxana Karnaukhova, Southern Federal University, Russia. So welcome aboard, and let's start. And I will give the floor to Hannes Meissner, who have agreed to be our facilitator today. Please, welcome.
Thank you, Oxana, and hello from Vienna. So it's already the last day of our summer school, and yeah, I'm very happy to be the facilitator or moderator of this final session, and I really look forward to summing up, some conclusions, things we've learned during the last couple of days. This is a very, very good constellation right now, because from a geopolitical point of view, we now unite different perspectives. Oxana, she's you're right now in Russia, and also in our project, you bring in the Russian perspective into our discussions. David, he's, I would say you're representing both the West and the view from down under, right? So that's maybe a bit further far from this internal struggle here in Europe. We're in between, and we're really in the center of this conflict and cooperation and competition with Russia. So I really appreciate your view from down under as well. And at the very same time, Australia is a country that has been integrated into Western security structures ever since, I would almost say. Yeah, and then Archil, you're from Georgia, and Georgia is a country that is really maybe almost close to be torn apart between the West and the East, a country that has for a very long time been oriented towards Russia, towards Europe, and a long tradition of cooperation with Europe. And then, of course, but on the other hand, Georgia is also a country prone to socialist and Soviet legacy, and the Russian influence is still very, very strong in Russia, also due to the fact that Georgia has not the full control power over certain territories. And but in recent years, I think Georgia has that's at least my impression, has slightly changed. So the new political leadership is trying to balance between Russia, or more or less shifting towards Russia. So that makes it very interesting for us now to get your perspective on those issues as well. And well, what are we talking about? We are talking about the new normality. The course and our project is dealing with competition, conflict, convergence, and cooperation between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union, and Russia. And now we're talking about a new normality. So there's a question that came into my mind very quickly, and probably all the students have the very same question. It is, what is the new normality? So, and from your perspective, from your background and geopolitical focus, I would first of all like to ask you what the new normality is. And maybe we start with Archil, because Archil, you're really in the center of this conflict and cooperation between the two blocs.
Thank you, Hannes, and thank you, Oksana, for inviting me. It's really nice that by the end of the day, the country which is neither part of EU, nor the part of other bloc is invited. You know, usually what we hear is like great state competition, and we frequently forget the role of small states in this competition, how small states provide platform for various politics and policies. And I do think that the year 2020 was extremely significant, and 2021 for Georgia, self-determination. Hannes said perfectly that Georgia has a long-lasting connections with Russia, then the Soviet legacy that still determines at least the old generation, the mid-age and the old generation, the way they perceive Georgia in this world. And definitely we have, on the other hand, the young generation who has that has nothing to do with Soviet legacy, but still our elites, they are keen to attach everything that we have to Soviet legacy. This is one of the biggest challenge I think in Georgia is when we speak about the perception of Georgia, we usually ask ourselves, who is Georgian in the modern era? I mean, what should we do? Who we are? Because for 2,000 years, Georgians were usually small nation defending from Persians, Ottoman Empire, for Russian Empire, trying to keep these family traditions, Orthodox Christianity, just to survive. Nowadays, when we don't need to survive anymore, yes, we do not possess the full control over our territories, as Hannes perfectly mentioned, but still, we are under the total control of our life nowadays. We don't need to survive, and as you perfectly said, Georgia had a long-lasting tradition of communicating with Europe for the last 30 years, probably. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Georgians were asking themselves, are we Europeans? Even though now you can hear in Georgia like 100% yes, but this is not actually the real answer, because Georgians still are waiting, if we are Europeans, what type of Europeans we are? Because for our history, we've been told that Georgians are Europeans, but we also combine some Asian traditions, Asian approaches. We are not 100% European by our mentality, by our religion, by our views. And also we are definitely influenced by South Caucasian traditions, North Caucasian traditions. And we can, let's be fair, they are not European in the way sometimes Europeans and Americans understand these values. And well, against the 90s, you know that we had a total crash in Georgia. There was no time for anything. So these discussions about the future of Georgia started probably after 2000s, when Eduard Shevardnadze, the second president of Georgia, was ousted by the so-called Velvet, or you can call the revolution, Rose Revolutions, by Mikhail Saakashvili. And his first statement after the honeymoon with Vladimir Putin ended in 2004, and he realized that Russia has a bit different view on Georgia, was to create a new Georgia. This concept, he introduced the concept of fleshed generation. It is Georgia Charetskhileby. It meant that his notion was that everyone above 35 years old, I'm talking now about 2005, year 2005, everyone above 35 years were representative of Soviet legacy, and we should have fleshed them, just say that we don't care about you, just leave. And that we needed everyone who is younger to build the new Georgians, European Georgians, without the Soviet legacy. And this was very popular among what I call self-proclaimed liberal elites, because they actually self-proclaimed liberal elites. But nowadays in 2020, these liberal elites in 2021 challenged the Western values themselves. And it's very interesting. We held parliamentary elections in Georgia. that were actually massively recognized by the West, by American ambassador, by European ambassador Karl Harls. And what happened, and what I call a big shift from indoctrinated liberal elites who in Georgia used to assume that the Georgia is the West. They used to just follow every single word that the Western colleague used to say. In this year, the liberal elites in Georgia said, you know what, we are done. Obviously, you finance us. We would like to become a member of the European Union, but it's time to listen to us. And this is very interesting. Those people who would have never dared to challenge European ambassadors this year says that you recognize this election, but we do not recognize. And this was a really nice statement by one of the leading popular Georgian media propaganda members like Nika Guaramia, who represents himself as a pro-Western, highly pro-Western, pro-American, and he was actually financed by American, by you. He said, the modern European policy in Georgia, in the American, is against Georgian people. You hurt Georgian people. This was something that was unimaginable to even listen like 5 years ago. Why this happened? Because these people thought that the European Union and American ambassador will always support these elites, that they will never counter these elites and will never like shake the finger saying that you are wrong. They thought that they monopolized this pro-Western approach. But as soon as the interests of the West, hit the interests of local liberal elites, suddenly these liberal elites started attacking the Western ambassadors. They even called Hubert Knirsch, who is like German ambassador to Georgia, a Russian agent, demanded him to go home. Like, this is normal in Georgia. Unfortunately, if you do not follow some rules, you don't agree with something, you are usually called the agent of the Kremlin, because when you use this formal agent of the Kremlin, it means that you don't need data anymore. It's not about data, it's not about MPUX, it's about what people say, how people perceive. And I think that this was a breakthrough. We live now in a new normality where Georgian society started questioning. I mean, even though our European future has no alternatives, and we should thank Russian Federation, because Russian Federation did everything possible not to give Georgia other ways around. So as people say, Europe and America is pushing Russia to China, and Russia is doing everything possible to push Georgia to NATO and European Union. And they understand this, but they have this view that the best way to handle Georgia is to use like firm hand, while Georgians don't like the firm hand policy, so they run to Europe. But despite this, Georgians started questioning if we are already Europeans. And some European diplomats even argued that Georgians are one of the first Europeans, because Georgia is a very old nation. They strive for European values, is 100 years long. But what type of Europeans we are? How are we going to integrate the European Union? Are we going to share all values? Are we going to, for example, yesterday there was a huge fight on the streets of Tbilisi with regard to gay pride. So those people who were like 5 years ago saying that if you are going to European Union, we should share all these values. We should have like gay pride, we should have, because this is the part of nowadays Europe. You should follow these rules, otherwise you are not a member of the European family. Now they question, should we actually do this to be a European? Should I, for example, share all values? And for Georgia, who lives in Georgia, it is a catastrophic breakthrough, I think, because we usually never have discussions about these topics. What we have in Georgia is that we are going to Europe, we are going to become a member of Europe, but how are we going to become? How our traditions sometimes contradict these values, how our Orthodox Christian Church, which holds a firm grasp on absolute majority of Georgians, are going to respond. And the Georgian Church is the leading institution in the country, not government, not police, but it's like church and then military forces. And how we're going also put this in the concept of integration policy, because the same Abkhaz people who are like don't recognize the common country with us, but it's not certain they are even more retrograde, they are even more conservative, how they will respond to these issues. So I will stop here saying that now in Georgia, I think that is a really breakthrough in this way. And it will be much more complicated nowadays for European colleagues and for those people who call themselves pro-Europeans to explain people how are they going to integrate Georgia, not on a unilateral law, just go to Europe, just accept everything, but how they're going to combine challenges that we actually have. It's not enough just to shout that I'm a European because I'm Georgian. We must have some plan, precise plan. Thank you, and sorry if I took so much time.
Thank you, Archil, for sharing those insights with us. I think that's very, very important. We are dealing with Russia as a country in between, and as you say, it is in fact a country in between the West and the East. And it's a very important point that you raised, that the country that in the past it was all oriented towards Europe and as the only alternative, but that now people are starting to doubt this or find a middle way and a more balanced approach towards that. We should come back to that later one. I would very much like to discuss that in more detail, whether Georgia might be a model for that. Because when you start, when people start thinking about different approaches, about a more balanced approach, maybe this could be a new normality and a model for EU-Russia, EU relations as well. But before we discuss that, I would like to give the floor to Oxana and Oksana's view on the new normality. So, Oksana, what, in your opinion, what's the new normality?
Thank you very much. Well, I'm a bit hesitant to think in detail what the new normality is, because what we first of all, what we are observing is a situation of long-lasting crisis, the crisis of the world order, as we know this from after the First World War and of course after the Second World War, how we know this from the past. And definitely we will have this kind of struggle between different forces. So Archil already mentioned that what we really observing right now is the idea that relations, I mean, in the world scale format, are dependent not only on great powers that we observed previously, I mean the US or super entity like European Union and Russia, of course, and raising Eurasian Union, but what we will have is new relations where small states will have a kind of influence. I think this is this thought, as I caught it correctly, is very valuable for understanding not only for EU-Russia relations and not only for EU and Eurasian Union relations, but also and in the Eurasian continent as it is. So we will have this kind of new sort of relations where great powers will be still important, but also small states will have an influence. On the other hand, I do think that another problem we will have in the nearest future, and we see how this kind of issue is becoming a feature of new normality, is actually the question of identity. Before, what we have observed for a long time is and was the situation when European identity was a flagman or a flagship idea. So everybody would like to be Europeans or pretend to be Europeans. Now we are really questioning the idea of European identity and identity as it is. And that I think this is the reason why Georgians are looking for a kind of European, non-European identification. So we are, and we think, okay, we are Europeans, but not as we know Europeans were. As for Russia, if we look at the same issue, we see the backsliding actually from the European identity and identification to quite another, like autonomous identity and the unique identity. So Russians are not Europeans right now. I mean, this is not about biology, and this is not about face looking or face control. I'm sorry about this, but identity, how we feel, how we identify ourselves. And of course, we will observe, I'm pretty sure that we will observe this backsliding even in progress. Not this progress, I mean, not progress like toward more liberal and Europeanization, but real backsliding back, not to the maybe to the Soviet or pre-Soviet identity. So this is that will be a very painful question for generations that will come in the nearest future. And so this is my second remark on new normality, how it will look like. And the third one, a great power will exist. How they will look like, this is also the great question for me. And what we will, and this is quite not. This is a question for practical implication and as well as theoretical one. I mean, what great power is about. Will we have nation states as great powers like US or Russia, or we will have like regional entities like Eurasian Union is look like today, or for instance Chinese Belt and Road. Could it be a great power or new generation great power? But for sure, the new normality will look, for me, will look like a reconfiguration process between the great powers in the global scale of this world. So, and of course, we are living in the situation of crisis, and this crisis will last for several years. We do not, I think we cannot expect the end of crisis, I think at least in 5 years or maybe even more. So how things are regressing right now. So we have to think about new normality as about crisis, and this crisis will have this kind of effect of, could I say it, prolonged effect. So when we have not just a couple of years and we will live in a happy new family of new great powers, but we will live in a situation of crisis, like in a plural world. Let me stop here, and maybe a question maybe will help us to clarify and to give more details. Thank you.
Thank you, Oxana. This is indeed a very clear message. Crisis as the new normality, and great powers that are still playing a decisive role and will probably also in the near and middle future play a decisive role. On the other hand, you raised that there are also regional entities like the Eurasian Economic Union. It's unclear what role they will play in the future. And at the very same time, you mentioned that in this constellation of crisis constellation, there's still room for smaller countries taking the lead. And yeah, at the same time, there's one more point. This situation, this crisis constellation also refers to the questioning of European identity, and that's something Archil has also raised. Liberalism, liberal values, European values. Is it really? I mean, maybe it's nothing God-given, but values are all, and identities is constructivism. And that this can change, and this can change vice versa, and also in exchange between different societies. So that's not necessarily a block constellation. Let's go back to this. I think there's an interesting question between that I will ask you later, because Archil spoke about, that Georgia has found its way in the two blocks. Oxana, you're raising the question or the point that we have a block, two blocks, and a conflict between those two blocks. But small powers and small countries might take a role and a lead in that. So this will be my question later on to you, whether Georgia might be a country taking the lead, a country that has found its new normality. But before we go to that, I would like to give the floor to David. In your eyes, what's new normality? And maybe you can already refer a little bit to that new constellation and this question that comes from Archil's and Oksana's point of view.
Well, thank you, Hannes. And I suppose as the non-European here on the panel, I should be a little bit provocative, and so I will perform that role with the greatest love of Europe. I also would observe as a non-European that Europe has been the source of some of the world's great destructive ideologies. Europe has been the place that has been battling for hundreds of years, cloaking what sometimes were just national interest battles, but sometimes they were bigger than that. Sometimes they were battles of ideology, of identity, constructed, as Hannes says, yes, but my goodness, they were destructive at the same time as being constructed. And in a sense, it seems to me as the non-European observer here that the discussions so much revolve around ideology in Europe. There's so much ideological talk about liberalism, when you go back to the origins of liberalism really was supposed to be about embracing diversity and the capacity of individuals to find their own way and to live interdependently, whereas the modern version of liberalism, that's kind of like the American version of liberalism that has taken hold in Europe, is a dogmatic ideology, just as dogmatic as its equal nemesis, which of course is the old ethno-nationalism of Europe that has been so destructive for so many centuries. And so we now seem to have these battles between these ethno-nationalist concepts, these liberal hegemonic concepts as well. And everybody has in their heads this black and white absolutist version of the world, that my way is the best and your way is the worst and mine has to prevail. And we are finding, I think, in the Western discourse that this is not just Europe, but this is the United States as well. And so we have this discourse where we're battling within ourselves between this very absolutist ideological liberalism and an absolutist ideological ethno-nationalism. We're gripped in this internal battle, and then we're projecting that out onto the world. And my argument as a citizen of the Asia Pacific would be, open your eyes and look to actually the new normal, because the new normal is that old ideological argument is over. You know, it's been lost, because where the arguments about human development and about international interdependence are being won is actually in those parts of the world where people and governments and businesses and communities are actually focused on the pragmatic questions rather than the ideological questions. And you only have to look to the part of the world that is growing, the part of the world where human development has been transformed in the last generation, the part of the world that now dominates the world economy, the world's technology, the world's innovation. And that when you measure good governance in things such as managing COVID, for example, in the last year and a half, where have those examples of good governance been? Well, it's the same places where we've seen the economic growth, and the same places where we've seen this pragmatic embrace of non-ideological solutions to internal governance and also to international relations. And so in a sense, these arguments within Europe and within America about these very dogmatic ideological solutions are completely missing the picture of what's happening in the Asia Pacific. And in fact, it's so important for the US to diminish the credibility of what's happening in the Asia Pacific that they've even deleted the word Asia. So we now talk about the Indo-Pacific, which of course is this grand geopolitical concept of encircling China with its enemies, and is a geopolitical mirror image of Eurasia. So again, we're projecting these sort of ideological concepts. But I would argue the new normal in the world, which therefore is going to impact dramatically on Eurasia, across Eurasia, the new normal is actually a pragmatic style of governance and a pragmatic interdependence, which is in no way painting the Asia Pacific as perfect, by the way. There are many flaws in governance, and in particular, of course, in the big one of China, but also in other big ones like India as well. There are many flaws in the way that this interdependence is developing, but it is an interdependence that is pretty much driven by a pragmatism. It's pretty much driven by a non-ideological approach to nations just finding what is in their mutual benefit, developing trade and investment relationships, developing people-to-people relationships based on principles of non-interference. Now, that's not to say that certain governments are not breaking those principles. In no way should we be naive about this. A great power will act like a great power. But the new normal is that these are the new principles being embraced. And actually, if we could for a moment stop talking about all the ideology and actually look at the facts on the ground, we could empirically look at what's working and what isn't working. And there are things that are working in this new normal very well. As I mentioned, economic development, pandemic control, things like that. Equally, there are some things that are not working so well. I mean, the rise of a new great power is obviously frightening the world, and that new great power is acting in some, reasonably aggressive ways, arguably not nearly as aggressive as previous great powers, but that's only so far. And we all have our fears about the future. So there are lots of unclear questions about how this new normal will evolve. But my argument as a citizen of the Asia Pacific would be the new normal isn't being developed in Europe or America. Europe and America gave us, many great things, but unfortunately they also gave us this commitment to ideological overdrive. And where there is ideological overdrive in places like China today, it is a product of, that's a classic product of Marxism-Leninism. So again, it's a European concept that is actually the one big problem in China. Whereas when China forgets the ideology and focuses on the pragmatic day-to-day governance and its pragmatic international relations, there are actually many things to learn that are working at the same time as their ideological blindness. So could the new normal be actually stepping back? Could we step back from ideology a bit and try and actually focus on what works and what doesn't work? That's definitely been what Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, Australia until the last couple of years, when Australia's been very influenced by this ideological turn in the rest of the West. But the non-ideological, pragmatic changes of the last 30 or 40 years that have shifted global power and global economic power to Asia just change this conversation. I just think it changes this conversation. If we continue having an internally focused conversation in Europe that's about ideology, we're just going to miss the big questions that are actually that actually promise to transform Eurasia. I mean, the potential for Eurasia to build pragmatic integration with the world's great economic growing region actually could be transformational. But if it only leads to more ideological conflict, I'm not sure that that Eurasia will be the focus. I think the focus may then be the focus of the great economic change to come may get more and more concentrated in the Asian region, and that will be a big loss for Europe. So how's that for some provocative comments?
Thank you, David. So in your eyes, the new reality, the global new reality is pragmatic interdependence, while this new principle is taking root in the world. Europe and probably the European Union on the one hand and Russia on the other hand are still caught in this struggle of ideological override. Do you think, Archil, that a country like Georgia, because Oksana's raised the idea that this conflict constellation, that this gives room to smaller countries taking the lead, and what do you think, Archil? Is a country like Georgia, it must not be Georgia or any other country in the region, ready to take the lead and maybe lead the big powers, the way of the big powers to this more pragmatic interdependence and more pragmatic approach?
Well, I think the issue of pragmatism was really, really nice, David. So thank you for introducing it. And this is something that small states don't have, at least in South Caucasia. That's what troubles me a lot, because I am from the generation of those people who were born on the edge of collapse of Soviet Union. So our whole life was about how bad was Soviet Union, how good is the West, and that's all. No critical approach. Why was Soviet Union bad, apart from being obviously having problems with totalitarian regimes? And what I used to hear all my childhood, there was everything bad in Soviet Union, no economy, nothing. But if it is right, why then so many people cry about Soviet Union? This was the simplest question I always had, including my father, who was definitely not a communist. He was one of the most libertarian persons, but used to say that, well, there was some good stuff in Soviet Union. That's why people cry, including like family issues, stability, some stable income, and so on and so forth. And that's why I said that 2020 and 2021 was the breakthrough, because I'm teaching at Tbilisi State University for the last 7 years. And finally, we got to a point where we can say not everything was bad in Soviet Union. Obviously, totalitarian regime and Stalinism do not represent Georgian people and the way Georgians think. God no, I mean, obviously not. But it doesn't mean that we should just say everything was good, and in Europe everything was bad, and in Europe everything is good. And this is the way, unfortunately, those people who are in charge of Georgia still have, because they do represent this reaction to Soviet elites. They are, as Georg Derologian perfectly said, American sociologists, they are the same level of radicals as the Soviet radicals were. So they are not about the ideology. They are absolutely in the ideology. And not only in Georgia, let's take South Caucasia. Let's take every single post-Soviet country. I've been to many of them. I mean, middle and small one. They just run from one radicalism. And Georgia is one of the most communist countries, whether someone likes to recognize it or not. Now, all those communist suddenly became the biggest Europeans I have ever met. And my colleague from Italy, a very experienced diplomat, once said, you know, you remind me of the Eastern Europe. I said, why? You all have these European flags, but you don't understand what this European flag means. Freedom is not in a flag, it's in critical thinking about this European flag. And this is what you don't have. And I mean, he is right, because what I said that Georgia is a Europe without European standards, like production and European critical thinking. And I can't just, I always remember the Nikolai Berdyaev, the source of Russian communism, where he explains why the communism that was just yet another ideology in Europe transformed to a religion in Russia. He said, well, the people who used to live under Christian orthodoxy, where everything was about the indoctrinated, you were unable to otherwise receive this ideology. So they just replaced Christian orthodoxy by the new religion called Marxism. So they just replaced one god by yet another god, and he was as totalitarian as the previous one. And this is what in Georgia is happening nowadays. I can give you just the basic example. When it comes to separatist regions of Georgia, what you usually expect from diplomats is balancing, having some, you know, some nurturing your diplomacy, going forward with things. What we have in Georgia is elite saying that nowadays Georgia is like a Germany occupied by Soviet Union. So the Georgia is like the Germany when it lost the Second World War, and the separatist Georgia regions are like a Berlin Wall. So even in there they put ideology, because this was about ideology. Obviously, Georgia is not Germany. Obviously, we don't have the Berlin Wall. But by doing this, they emphasize that it's not about solving the issue in a pragmatic, as David say, way. It's about winning the ideological fight. And you can hear that they say one day Russia will collapse the Soviet Union, and the West will win again. Even though by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, no one spoke about victory as such. The ideology was about taking side ideology and going to pragmatics, but this still is prevails. And saying this, unfortunately, I don't see Armenia, Georgia, Russia, other countries being able to step forward, because we need to change a few generations still to get rid not only from Soviet legacies. People frequently argue, you can't blame everything on Soviet legacy. There are people who have nothing to do with Soviet legacy, but still they are so indoctrinated. You just listen to people and they say the West is inevitable, the progress is inevitable. As a scholar, to me personally, it's just mind-blowing. How can you be a scholar and say that everything is inevitable except death, probably? Even taxes you can avoid. And that's why, answering the general question, unfortunately, I don't see how can Georgia actually contribute to this de-indoctrinization, even though we can do this. And Hannes really well right, the issue that now we have a balancing approach. Yes, after the regime change in 2012 or 13, when Mikhail Saakashvili, who was extremely pro-American, he was not pro-Western, he was a pro-American. When he was replaced by Georgian Dream, the first statement was, let's take aside the ideology. Let's speak with Russia on a pragmatic level. We know what they want. They know what we want. So the policy now is balancing. We don't run with NATO flags, the European flags, near the Russian warships, you know, because this makes something that Saakashvili was doing. It's something that actually by neoconservative movements and some highly, indoctrinated pro-Western colleagues was supported. All this shouting that the Georgia will be NATO and they will strike you, and all it was taken. But as soon as they did this, now the opponents are walking to European Union and US every day saying that they are pro-Russians because they don't run with European flags anymore. And Georgian Dream, the balancing powers are always enforced to go to Europe and say, we are not pro-Russians. We are not crazy people. We don't have another war with Russia only because we shout out about NATO, because we know that Georgia is not in the middle of Europe. We are not surrounded by Switzerland and Germany. We are surrounded by Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, Iran. Who will on earth help us if war erupts again. Unfortunately, no one. So yes, we are for Europe. Alternative to Russian aggression, what Georgians call, is NATO, but we are not fanatics. We live in a real world, and that's why 2020 and 2021 was really nice year for those people who finally can say that I am pro-European, but it doesn't mean that I should accept everything that Europe says. I have a critical thinking, I have my mind, I have my traditions, so I can speak in Australian English and not British English to be a real British, you know. I have this right, and that I can contribute to NATO, but be pragmatic and not send Georgian soldiers to die to prove that I am pro-NATO. And this, unfortunately, and I hope that this pragmatism will go further in Georgia, not only in Georgia, and definitely like just last war in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan was also very complicated for Georgia, because there was Turkey's interest, Russia's interest, and the region is getting more and more squeezed between these powers. And small states need finally to get rid of these ideological issues and finally look at pragmatism, because we are too small to have this naive approach that ideology will save us. No, unfortunately, saying and shouting that I'm European will not help you to win the war, will not help you to build a better country. And unfortunately, Georgia is one of the poorest countries in the world. And just shouting that I will go to NATO and this will solve my issues. This is how, unfortunately, people represent frequently, that NATO membership equals to prosperity. Yet another lie. Yes, as soon as we break this formula, starting pragmatic, I think the small nations will be able to remind the great nations that, you know what, all these places are really nice, like between Moscow and Washington, but they are like real issues. And let's start talking about that, because we cannot afford these ideological issues. You can afford. You have big countries, big money reserves, but we have no reserves. We need to have day by day issues being solved. Thank you.
Thank you, Archil. I take two messages from your explanations. First of all, small countries are often too small, too poor to change the constellation, and there's not much room for overcoming the conflict or playing a leading role, which a little bit contradicts Oxana's the points Oxana has raised. Secondly, and when I listen to you explaining the constellation, I really have the impression that what David has said is true. So it's all about history, European history, the Cold War between the bloc between the West and the East, how we look on that today. Also about liberalism, it's about ideology and traditionalism. But I'm not that sure if it's only about that. So maybe there are also other reasons and structural root causes of this conflict, maybe economic ones, geostrategic ones. And Oksana, what's your view on that? Is it really all about ideology, or are there also other factors playing a decisive role?
It's quite an interesting question, and I would start with what David told. I mean, pragmatism as a new normal. And actually, I like this idea personally, because what we have in today's picture is how pragmatism is rising, and pragmatism has already demonstrated how successful the economic development or joint economic development or regional development would be. So that's why pragmatism is look like raising a new normal. At the same time, what I'm really thinking about is how pragmatism exploited by, for instance, the Russian Federation, as we know from the Eurasian Union point of view, how this kind of pragmatism contradicts with what the European Union tries to exploit. I mean, we see this kind of gap, I would use this word. So there is a gap between so-called multilateralism, which is still exploited by the European Union, and actually this kind of multilateralism at the same time is came from ideological point of view as well. So it's a kind of some analysts tell about postmodern type of power, etc., etc. And what we have when we look at the pragmatic vision of Russia, of China, etc., we see this kind of national interest. So that's why my ball to Archil and to Georgia's case is actually about pragmatism as a balancing and providing national interest, first of all, not trying to push towards like ideal multilateralism which the European Union plays with, but the question is, and this is a question for all my colleagues, usually when we find this national interest as one of the pragmatism approach, visualization, let's say so, very often we meet the idea that this kind of national interest promotion is about modern or even pre-modern situation, and there is a kind of, this gap when the European Union comes a bit higher, a bit to the future, while Russian Federation and other states are looking and standing a bit below this, together with this national interest. So my question, and not a doubt, but still a question, is what we really think about national interest and pragmatism as like a modern state, and if so, what we will have, what we can have as a new normal? Will it be a black slide into the national interest and nation states, or we are observing a new kind, a new sort of pragmatism, a new sort of national interest, and then we will have another new normal, quite a different sort of this. So this is the question that I would like to raise, and I have no answer actually. So I'm still thinking about the situation as a new normal. And coming back to the Georgian case, I really like it because Georgia, unfortunately, is not lucky because of location. I mean, Georgia, as many Caucasian countries, I mean, Armenia, for instance, Azerbaijan, all the states are located in a very complicated, concerning constellation point of Hannes. These countries are located in a very complicated region titled Black Sea region. And this region is quite unique because some of these states are inside the European Union, like Romania and Bulgaria, etc. On the other hand, we have Turkey and Russia, and so we see there's a kind of very complicated picture. And this is a quite unique region. Comparably with what David told about the Pacific, I mean Asian Pacific, which to my mind looks a bit differently as well as unique. So, but we have two different regions, and we have to, I would say, radically different regions like Black Sea and Asian Pacific. And my question also, I'm trying to answer this question right now for myself, first of all. What would be learned from experience of these two different regional projects, I would say, if any lessons we have? So this is my also provocative.
Yeah, that's really good. It's maybe but so you somehow did it's a counter perspective to this new Asian Pacific model of new pragmatism, and actually it also refers to the critical view that the Chinese interest is mainly driven by economic interests, economic and political national interests, that and the power China has accumulated, and that other countries just have to accept this new national power. And critical voices actually say that this is the game of the 19th century, that this is a new colonial game of raising new strategies and new patterns of cooperation that are actually solely based on national interests. And that's my I would take this your question now, Oksana, and give it straight to David. What do you think about?
Thank you. I think Oksana's questions are critical, and I do want to answer those. But first, I have to respond to that comment about are we just back in the 19th century? And I do have to say this from a personal perspective. For example, I grew up in Tasmania, which is the island state of Australia, where the British Empire killed everyone. There was total genocide. They documented it all. They celebrated it. Charles Darwin wrote about it as a great example of the superiority of the white race. So I don't know that we're back in the 19th century. I think to accuse China of neo-colonialism is very convenient if we want to whitewash actually the history of colonialism. But the history of colonialism was rotten, and so to equate investment by companies in building roads and railways and power stations, to equate that with empires that went and killed people, these are not comparable at all. So I think that firstly, that's important, that we don't look backwards and use false equivalents. But I think looking forward, however, there are some continuities, and one of the continuities that Oksana talks about is national interest. I mean, there's no doubt that the nation state still exists. So even though we've had enormous innovation, thankfully, some great innovation in Europe, the best example of regional integration in the world for good reasons. But despite that innovation, the nation state still is where power resides, and whether this is Georgia or whether it's Germany or whether it's China, wherever this is in the world, it's the state that has the monopoly on the use of force. Or neighbouring states, as in the case of Georgia, who also, of course, have the capacity to utilise force. And so the question of force is a real issue in why nation states continue to exist and continue to be the fundamental unit of organisation. And of course, not only can states use force against each other and against their own citizens if they're so inclined, but also, of course, states can raise taxes. And so states have the economic power as well as the military power. And so even if there is regional integration for trade and investment and regional cooperation and harmonisation and setting rules and standards, etc., as advanced as the European Union or just in less advanced ways in other parts of the world, still the nation state is still the fundamental entity. I mean, the European Union could fall apart tomorrow, and I hope it doesn't, but it could. And the nation states, the 27 nation states, would continue to exist until such time as they found themselves in conflicts or revolution. But the nation state is the actual entity. And so I would argue there's a realist perspective to this that means fundamental issues still have to be addressed at the national level. And as a democrat, even more important than any of those other questions is that we can actually elect our governments in democracies. Now, not all of the world has that privilege, but those of us who do have that privilege it's only at the national level we can do that as well. So power is not only existing at the national level, but it's accountable at the national level. It's not accountable at a regional or a global level at all. And the European Union might be the most advanced example of regional integration, but it's also a very good example of a huge democratic deficit, and therefore is generating such a frustration and such a backlash for that reason. So I think there are fundamental issues about the nation state, and so national interest, of course, is going to drive nations, and nations as big as China or the United States, but also individual nations such as the one I'm living in at the moment, Hungary. I mean, Hungary is going to be driven by its national interest first before anything, and I just think that's realism to my mind. But then in terms of the regional integration that we're all looking for, I mean, there's no reason why you can't have an accountable and well-governed nation state that also seeks close integration and close, as I would say, pragmatic integration with other countries in order to benefit. And this is the whole point about interdependence. So the Keohane's argument about the nature of interdependence is that the reason nations enter into interdependence is there are benefits for all sides. If you can find mutually beneficial arrangements, you do. And so this is the thing that we're all trying to figure out, whether it's the Eurasian Economic Union, whether it's the European Union, or whether it's the new innovations in looser and more flexible kinds of Asian regionalism, like ASEAN, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's biggest free trade area, or whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative. These are much more flexible, less rigid, less institutionalized regionalisms, but they're still regionalisms. They're still about finding interdependence, finding mutual benefit between countries. And then finally, but I don't want to miss the fact that at the global level as well, because even though we exist at the national level and even though we seek benefits at the regional level, we also have some global challenges, and international peace and security is the big one, which is why we have a UN Security Council, but also climate change, pandemics, new technology that is completely going to, artificial intelligence driven technology is going to be so interconnected around the world that the national borders are going to have a lot less influence in the direction that technology will take in the future. So there are so many areas in which actually we've got to get our heads around multilateralism as well. And multilateralism was all designed by the US and others after the Second World War to grapple with the issues of the 20th century. And it didn't function very well. I mean, it was gripped by the Cold War. And after 1989, when the US had a great opportunity to make multilateralism function better, the US turned away from multilateralism and actually started to trash some of the institutions of the United Nations and did not strengthen them or invest in them or build a new multilateralism for the 21st century. So now we're in crisis. I mean, the World Trade Organization is in crisis. The United Nations is toothless and worthless most of the time, I'm sad to say. And in a way, it all needs to be rethought. It all needs to be reconfigured for a new century, and new rising powers such as China is inventing new institutions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are organizations that are functioning quite differently. They're challenging some of the liberal values of the UN system, but they're still addressing all of the pragmatic questions of how multilateralism might work. And those new organizations actually are functioning very well if you measure them on pragmatic grounds. But if you measure them on ideological grounds, well, they may not suit your ideology. So lots of questions about how multilateralism might need to be reconfigured for this new world as well. And I think that's closely aligned with the discussions we're having, because the new regionalisms we're developing actually are going to really be in trouble if we fail to solve those big multilateral problems, particularly the big ones like climate change.
Yeah, thank you, David. As you say, I think we've reached now very, very vivid discussion, level of discussion, but still there are only 20 minutes left, and I would like to open the discussion to the wider audience, to our students. So dear students, are there any questions you have and you would like to raise and ask us? So please go ahead, don't be shy. There's no reason to be shy. So any of you who would like to share your perspective on the new the new reality? So what do you think? What's the new reality? What have you learned during this week, and what's your impression about the new reality?
You can ask your questions via the chat. So if you have any troubles to asking loudly, I mean connection is poor, etc., please use the chat for asking us.
So you can still ask your questions. Oksana, do you see the chat area? I can't see it actually. So
yes, I see, and I see someone is typing, but I do not see the question yet.
I'm still searching the chat area.
I do not think that you have an the chat is visible only for those who are inside the university. Oh,
okay.
I can
So maybe you can.
How comfortable.
Yeah, I have no access to the chat too, so.
Yeah,
well,
we just get to talk. We don't get to write anything.
If there are no questions, we can ask questions to ourselves.
Definitely, but you
Oksana,
know,
do you already have a question, or do you want to go on?
It's still the typing. I don't know.
Typing is going on.
Yeah. So it's a long question. So.
Maybe it's very good anyway to calm down a little bit, you know.
I mean, be my guest, but you cannot ask my questions.
The hot discussion.
But you're welcome. So very Russian style. I do not expect questions. Be our guest.
So Oksana, just read the question as soon as we have it, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, may I ask a question for everybody in the room right now? Actually, my question is still about small states. I mean, I know that ASEAN is a wonderful, for me, it's a wonderful example how they deal with the issue of ideology. I mean, they decided that they would not intervene this space, and they welcome everyone who would like to join for economic prosperity, and they are not going to intervene political issues, specifically internal political issues, I mean, in state. But at the same time, there are some small states within the ASEAN. So my question is, could we use this type of regional integration as an example of successful overcoming the ideological issue, and would it be beneficial for small states around the world? I mean, how would other small states throughout the world could use this kind of experience? Why not? This is my first question: how useful and to what extent this experience is useful for nowadays? How can we use this experience? And also, my question for Archil, as an example, I mean, Georgian example, would it be useful once you are located somewhere in between great powers? It doesn't matter what kind of powers are. I mean, between European, because Georgia is really grasped in between these two different great powers, and I understand and I recognize how difficult it is. I mean, to overcome these different influences and to find your own identity, I would say, economic identity, political identity, etc. So this is my question for all of you. For me, it's really difficult to make some remarks on it because I'm happily located within the great power of Russia. So I really understand how Russia deals with these questions. I mean, we are happily great power, or pretend to be. We are really dominating the Eurasian Union, and it doesn't matter, no matter who criticizes. We really implement or try to implement this kind of pragmatism approach. And we are not going to intervene really this ideological space. And actually, the Eurasian Union has already demonstrated. So, well, we use memories. I mean, Soviet legacy as well as a point of searching for tight ties with our vis-a-vis, but still we are trying to avoid this intervention into the internal political space. So I'm really happy with all of this. So that's why I would like to listen from you.
Great, Oksana. And as time is running out, maybe we can use this question for a final comment by all three of you. And maybe you can we can also include the question of the student into the final comment. So now I'm really curious. What is the question?
The question is about China, which is a hot topic for today and actually for summer school. So the question is about still Chinese influence and Chinese dominance, and whether we will have a kind of new normality in sense of Chinese intervention. I mean, within at least the Eurasian continent, but also globally. So would we have a new normality with let me rephrase it, like a new normality with a new domination and a new great power, which is like will give us a new world order. So we will have a combination of great powers again.
Okay, very good. So Archil, may I ask you to go ahead, then David, and then finally Oksana, it's time for you to conclude the session.
Yes, thank you. So with regard to Georgian national interest, I will be a very short one. I think, Hannes, you formulated really well. This is the way people think in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I can be responsible for this assumption that they are too small to afford so many stuff that Russia, EU can afford, and this approach is used. For example, they say we cannot give up even 1 meter of our land because we are too small to give up. We cannot let such big level of liberalism to ourselves because we are very small, and because we need to protect ourselves. So, as you said, obviously beyond the ideological approach, there are historical determinants that push Georgia to pursue. For example, let's take like Turkey is Georgia's strategic partner, is a member of NATO, and for liberal elites, criticizing Turkey means criticizing NATO, what is by default sinful behavior. But in Acar Autonomous Republic, which was under the Ottoman Empire for years, relationship to Turkey is extremely strained because they have this historic memory that 100 years ago Turkey was actually conquering and taking Batumi by force, and the liberal elites in Georgia need to re-educate these people, saying that yes, it was, but now Turkey is our strategic partner. But thanks to Erdogan's some European American neo-Osmanism called this policy, these fears just increase. So this is something that Georgia is forced to fight against, because historic memory, Georgia's small country is very strong here, and it's very complicated to overstep this. So definitely history matters. And what I actually wanted to say, sometimes, you know, I'm not sure whether Georgian liberal elites and some of my European American colleagues can make difference between Russia and Soviet Union. Sometimes when I speak with these people, they not only make mistakes saying that Soviet Union was a Russia, I frequently hear this one, but they also speak in the way that now that we still have Soviet Union in the face of Russia. And the argument is that the Soviet Union KGB agent Vladimir Putin, but this is, come on, we had so many KGB agents and they do not represent Soviet Union. And this is, I think, very, this is false claim that frequently pushes people to make false judgments, because nowadays Russia is not a Soviet Union. And I mean that there is no ideology, actually. When we speak about the controversy between EU, US, and Russia, it's not about ideology. I have never heard in Russia people like regular saying that we want to go to Soviet Union, we don't like capitalism, we don't like American pigs. As Russian expert Markov perfectly said, no, Russia loves America. Russians would like to live like Americans. But what we don't stand is when Russians are trying to play in our backyard without our permission. That is the biggest challenge for Russia. And this comment was made when one youngster said that this American and started about ideology, and the Markov stopped him. This was a council of federal council. He said, no, we love America, but when Americans are doing in our backyard, this is what we cannot stand. And I don't think that in Georgia people realize it's not about ideology anymore. It's about national interests. Russia has its own national interests, and you cannot turn a blind eye saying that you are Soviet Union, they are not. And the last one, what I wanted to say about China, it's interesting that Georgia is trying to pursue pragmatic relations with China. If you come here, you will see that the infrastructure is built by China. But as soon as the West, and it was just Mike Pompeo, felt that China can have some kind of influence, Mike Pompeo just straightforward said, we didn't pay so much money to Georgia to see it falling under the knee of China. What means that still there is ideology. So as soon as one of the sides feels that there can be some lack of influence or rise of influence, the ideology plays a crucial role in small countries like Georgia, where obviously you have not so many ways to play because you have small country, and one road can decide the whole fate of your attachment to EU, US, or China. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
I'll start with a brief comment about Oksana's question about ASEAN and whether we can learn from the ASEAN model. I think we can, but I think it's also important that we remember the differences between every region of the world. And so the historical experience of ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, was that they were post-colonial and they had post-colonial elites. And in particular, I'm thinking of the star performer really of Singapore, is probably the best case example of this, where, you really had a very talented elite that had been educated in places like London, had come back to a newly independent country, and Singapore was under enormous threats from its neighbours, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Malaya, And yet that small elite was able to develop a vision for a new country, and they're able to invest in a meritocratic system of institution building and a strategy for economic and human development. So pretty interesting case studies to look at. And when you think of there are some parallels, I suppose, with the post-Soviet world and with even with Central Europe as well, where I am here in Hungary. I mean, it reminds me of the days when I was here 30 years ago after the change of system in Central Europe. There was a feeling at the time that it was a bit like the post-colonial era, but those same things didn't happen though. You know, so what happened here in Central Europe, instead of developing each nation developing its own strategy and its own elite for its own institution building, of course, instead of that, they just took on board something off the shelf from the European Union and just decided we're just going to copy and we're just going to join and integrate into the European Union. So perhaps, which by the way was probably a very good thing. I'm not criticising it, but it probably had a byproduct that we didn't really envisage 30 years ago, and that is that actually these countries then didn't really develop their own ownership of the direction they were taking in the way that those Southeast Asian countries certainly did. And so the Southeast Asian pragmatism, as I would call it, is very different, therefore, from the much more ideological approach that tends to happen in this part of the world. And I think the same applies to this argument about China. You know, we are looking at China from European eyes, imagining that China will act in the same way as great powers of the past. And in some ways it will, because in some ways all great powers will use their power as they can, right? But the question is the last few words of that sentence, as they can. How can they utilize their power? And I think it's important to remember in the case of China that it is surrounded by strategic rivals. Not only is it encircled by the United States military with lots of nuclear weapons pointed at it and an overwhelming force from the United States with its 800 global bases, but in Asia itself, China is surrounded by strategic rivals like India, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Australia. You add them all up and actually China is encircled, and so no wonder they feel encircled. They actually are. And so the great power strategy that China will develop is arguably much more likely to be an economic one than a strategy of trying to somehow take over the world as former great powers have, because just how China would do that is not clear, despite all the narratives that we hear about supposed military bases and supposed foreign intervention, etc. When you dig and you look at the facts and the evidence around these cases, you usually find that where China is utilising its power is in economic terms rather than strategic terms in most cases. I mean, there are some exceptions, and they tend to be related to China's core interests and its core neighbourhood, where it wants to obviously maintain what it believes belongs to it. That includes, of course, Taiwan, which is hugely problematical for the world, but that is China's view. The People's Republic of China's view is that Taiwan belongs to it. So that's an issue. But beyond that, even somewhere as fragile and as weak as Myanmar, which is terribly governed, sitting next door to China, you would imagine that if China was going to be this aggressive imperial power, that China would just walk into Myanmar and solve its governance problems, just take it over and just, put all of these warring tribes out of action, disarm them all and just, run all the mines and take over the ports. China could so easily dominate Myanmar, you would think, but it doesn't. It actually has no capacity. It's actually had humiliating backdowns. In fact, the Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, visited Myanmar immediately after its recent election as a sign of confidence in Aung San Suu Kyi. And a couple of weeks later, the military, of course, overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi and engineered a military coup. So what a humiliation to China that was. So I don't think the evidence yet is that China is going to act like an old-fashioned great power. However, it will act like a new normal great power. So it's an economic questions, I think, are the major ones to be looking at.
Thank you, David. So as time is running out anyway, and you're the organizer of the summer school, Oxana, and you're also part of the project and this discussion.